For most people, the only word that comes to mind when they think of the Nokia N-Gage is failure. And with good reason. First released in October 2003, the device failed to light up either the gaming world or the cell phone world. On the gaming side, you first had to remove the back of the phone and the battery to put a new game in. Not very convenient. On the phone side of things, talking was done on the side, earning the nickname of Taco Phone. While these flaws would be improved upon on the follow-up device, the N-Gage QD, both the original device and the QD failed to build any real market share. The device itself, though, really wasn't that bad. While Japan was apparently enjoying all sorts of capabilities that most other markets wouldn't see until smartphones took off, the rest of us were limited to quite simple phones. The idea of having a device capable of 3D games on the go and other multimedia capabilities was quite hard to resist for some of us, despite the poor outlook for the device from the onset. I picked up an N-Gage when it was announced that you could get 3 games with the device for free, picking up Pandemonium, Tomb Raider, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, all of which I enjoyed. We could go on and on about the pros and the many cons of the device, and maybe I will someday, but I wanted to focus on 2 different types of N-Gage QD units today. The first unit is a prototype unit, as seen when removing the battery. These aren't the most uncommon things, with various revisions ending up in the public's hands. Turning on the device shows why many of them do exist. In the lead up to the QD's launch, Nokia sent out demo units for stores like GameStop and EB Games to try to attract some sort of attention for their device. The hardware was labeled as prototype, with the software flashed to a demonstration mode. While some people did flash a more standard firmware, apparently at least some of the demonstration revisions, if not all of them, are missing certain hardware elements that means they could never quite operate like a phone or a retail unit. But documentation on these sorts of changes are quite limited online. As is, the unit does have a few quirks. For one, game progress isn't saved after resetting the device, which kind of makes sense for a store display. And it doesn't matter if you want to take the device on the go, because within seconds of unplugging the device from power, the N-Gage powers off, new battery charged or not. Other than that fact, some of the apps are locked out, but it's not really the most interesting unit in the scheme of things. Now, the second unit today is quite a bit more interesting and much rarer to see. This N-Gage QD unit is a development unit with special firmware meant to aid in the game development for the platform. We don't really think a whole lot about mobile platforms and fancy development kits, but here we have it. Unlike the demo unit, this one does operate on its battery. While the phone seems fairly standard, it too runs a different firmware, although in this case it adds a few programs for developers. N-Gage Performance Analyzer does just that, allowing you to run the app in the background and export the progress via Bluetooth or to the MMC card. N-Gage Trace Monitor is used to monitor the application with minimal performance impact. N-Gage Game Deck Debugger sadly crashes on both of my developer units, due to the unit not being hooked up to the PC properly, probably anyway. But again, it all leads to more development feedback. Next up today is something I didn't know even existed, and a flash card for the N-Gage. It makes sense that developer flashcards would exist, but again, it's not really something I thought a whole lot about before. It is marked as blank, but on it seems to be a few development-related samples. One sample tests some of the network features, none of which are currently active, so it doesn't do a whole lot. One is a graphic sample that shows lots of trees on the screen, which may not seem too impressive, especially with the frame rate, but most other phones at the time couldn't do this either. The last sample that works shows what can happen with screen tearing, and I imagine documentation would go into more detail to prevent it from happening in the first place. Sadly, the last app on here causes a kernel error, so I'm not sure how to get it going quite yet. This is where I ask for your help. Documentation on how to dump N-Gage games is quite limited, to say the least. We know that the N-Gage used multimedia cards, and that people were able to create a way to dump and get the dumps working on other devices, but that process seems to be gone. If you or someone you know has experience dumping N-Gage titles, I'd love to get this so-called blank card backed up, in addition to possibly backing up the firmware from the devices themselves. What may help with this process is this, the SF20 SDK. Built for the N-Gage QD, this device plugs into the back of the QD, replacing the battery, having its own power pack that isn't the standard power supply. Documentation on this is just as limited as the development for the platform. Some people may have used these units to flash the firmware using Nokia's software. That may help with the firmware backup, but it still leaves some questions unanswered, like why it was included with some development phones. I have a hunch that it may be useful in development, such as with that debugger app, but I'll have to dig up some new software to see if things are actually possible. I do hope you've enjoyed a look at some rare N-Gage items. It isn't the most beloved platform out there, but it is a piece of gaming history. I'm still looking for the video converter that would allow me to capture video from N-Gage games, but that seems to be eluding me right now. Hit that subscribe button, check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/p2ponline, where we've added a new $3 Discord tier, and until next time, thanks for watching.